I get it, you're staring at a rack of spec sheets and wondering if you're about to pour a chunk of your budget into something that will sit half filled with dust because it just isn't the right fit for your workload. The fear of buying a server that looks great on paper but turns out to be a nightmare to manage is real, especially when you're juggling tight margins and a growing client base. If you're on the fence about the Supermicro SYS 5039MS H8TRF, I'm going to walk through the practical side of what it actually brings to the table and who will genuinely benefit from it. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, this is a Barebone 3U rack mount chassis that packs 8 separate LGA 1151 nodes into a single enclosure. In plain language, you're essentially getting 8 mini servers that share a common power supply, cooling system, and chassis. That design is aimed at small to mid-sized data centers, remote offices that need a dense compute footprint, or even tech enthusiasts who want to run multiple isolated environments without buying 8 separate cases. The 1600-watt power supply is generous enough to keep all 8 nodes humming under load, and the shared cooling means you won't be installing a fan for each board individually. If you're the kind of buyer who needs to run a handful of virtual machines, container clusters, or edge computing tasks, this system can be a sweet spot. Imagine you run a managed service for a few clients, each needing their own isolated Linux environment for testing. Instead of buying 3 or 4 full rack servers and paying for extra space, you can slice this single 3U unit into 8 independent nodes, each with its own CPU and memory slots. That translates to lower real estate cost, reduced cabling complexity, and a single point of power management. For a small MSP, that's a tangible efficiency gain. On the flip side, if your workload leans heavily on GPU acceleration, high throughput storage, or you need massive memory per node, this chassis will feel cramped. The LGA 1151 socket limits you to certain generations of Intel CPUs, and while you can populate each node with a decent quad-core, you won't be able to drop in the latest Xeon or a high core count Ice Lake processor. Also, because the system is Barebone, you'll have to source your own CPUs, RAM, and storage drives. That's not a problem if you already have a parts inventory, but for someone looking for a plug-and-play solution, it adds a layer of planning and extra cost. One of the strengths that shows up when people actually deploy this box is the ease of scaling. Because each node is independent, you can start with 4 populated slots, monitor performance, and then add the other 4 as demand grows without having to rack new units or rewire power strips. The shared 1600-watt PSU does a decent job of handling the incremental load, and the chassis includes redundant fans that keep temperatures in check even when you push all 8 nodes to 80% CPU utilization for extended periods. In a real-world scenario, I've seen a small research lab use the system to host 8 separate data analysis pipelines, each with its own allocated RAM and storage, and they never reported thermal throttling or power trips. However, the very thing that makes this a compact solution can also be a hidden trade-off. The shared power and cooling means that a failure in the PSU or a fan can affect all 8 nodes simultaneously. Supermicro does offer optional redundant power supplies, but that bumps the price up and adds another component you have to watch. If you're running mission-critical services where uptime is non-negotiable, you'll want to budget for that redundancy and perhaps keep a spare PSU on hand. Another practical consideration is the management interface. Supermicro provides the IPMI, Intelligent Platform Management Interface, out of the box, which gives you remote console access, sensor monitoring, and power control. In day-to-day use, that's a lifesaver because you can reboot a single node without touching the rack. The only snag is that the IPMI firmware can be a bit dated compared to newer BMC solutions, so you might find occasional compatibility quirks with the latest operating system releases. It's not a deal breaker, but it does mean you'll want to keep the firmware updated and test your remote workflow before you go live. Who should skip this server? If you're a startup that needs a single, powerful machine for a database or a web application, you're probably better off with a single higher-tier rack server that can house larger CPUs and more memory per socket. The overhead of managing 8 separate nodes could actually waste time you'd rather spend developing. Likewise, if you're an AI research group that relies on GPU clusters, the limited PCIe lanes and lack of space for dedicated graphics cards make this chassis a poor match. In those cases, you'll end up with unused slots and a higher total cost of ownership. For the right audience, IT consultants, edge site operators, small colocation customers, or hobbyists who love to experiment with multi-node Kubernetes clusters, this system hits a sweet spot between density and